The first time I noticed the family next to me, I honestly thought they'd been there the whole afternoon. The strange part wasn't seeing them. It was realizing I'd somehow missed them arriving. Their tent stood less than 50 feet from mine. It was a large gray canvas tent, one of those expensive ones that takes at least 20 minutes to pitch. The rainfly was perfectly tensioned. The guy lines were straight. Their chairs were arranged around an untouched fire ring as neatly as furniture in a showroom. I had spent the last hour splitting firewood, filling my water bottles, and walking back and forth between my truck and my campsite. There was no way someone could have set all that up without me hearing a single thing. I actually looked around for their vehicle. Nothing. No SUV. No pickup. No trailer. Just the tent. At the time, I figured they'd parked somewhere farther down the road. Looking back, I wish I'd kept driving the moment I couldn't find tire tracks leading into their site. I've camped alone for most of my adult life. People always ask if it gets lonely. Honestly, that's the point. I spend 45 hours a week managing inventory in a warehouse outside Columbus. By Friday evening, I'd gladly trade fluorescent lights and forklifts for wind in the trees and a cheap camp chair. Most weekends I avoid the popular campgrounds. Too many generators. Too many Bluetooth speakers. Too many people trying to recreate their living room in the woods. Pine Hollow was different. Only 12 primitive sites sat around a small lake tucked deep inside the national forest. No electricity. No cabins. Cell service disappeared about 15 miles before the entrance. Exactly what I wanted. When I arrived just after 3, the campground looked nearly empty. An older couple had parked a small camper near the entrance. A faded green Subaru sat beside Site 3. Everything else looked vacant. I chose Site 8 because it backed up against the lake. From my chair, I could watch the sun disappear through the pine trees while fish broke the surface every few minutes. It was quiet enough that I could hear squirrels knocking pine cones onto the forest floor. The kind of quiet you don't realize you've been missing. For the first couple of hours, everything was exactly how I'd hoped. I pitched my tent, collected enough firewood for the night, made coffee, read a few chapters of a paperback I'd been carrying for months. Nothing unusual. Then, just before dinner, I noticed something that bothered me more than it should have. Every campsite had a reservation post near the road. Mine had a tag clipped to it. Site 8, reserved. The post across from mine was empty. No tag. No paper. No name. I assumed the campground host had forgotten to clip one on. Then I looked past the post. The tent was already there. I walked toward the campground map to double-check. Maybe I'd mixed up the site numbers. The faded wooden map listed every campsite around the loop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12. I frowned. There was no Site 9. I actually traced the numbers with my finger. 8, 10. Someone had skipped 9 entirely. I laughed under my breath. Probably an old map. Maybe they'd renumbered the campground years ago. It wasn't worth thinking about. By the time I walked back, smoke from my campfire drifted lazily toward the lake. The gray tent stood exactly where I'd left it. I was opening a can of chili when the tent flap unzipped. A man stepped out, mid-40s, average build, dark hiking pants, forest green jacket despite the warm weather. He didn't stretch after sitting inside, didn't look around, didn't even blink against the evening sun. He simply walked to one of the folding chairs and sat facing my campsite. A moment later, a woman emerged. Then a teenage girl, then a little boy who couldn't have been older than 8. They repeated the exact same routine. Walk, sit, face my fire. None of them spoke, not even to each other. I smiled and lifted my hand. The father slowly returned the wave. The others didn't react. I remember thinking they must have had an argument before arriving. Families get quiet after long car rides. Still, something about it felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced behaving like campers without ever actually going camping. I kept waiting for normal things to happen. The kids should have wandered toward the lake. The parents should have unloaded coolers. Someone should have gathered wood, started a fire, complained about mosquitoes, anything. Instead, the four of them remained perfectly still while daylight slowly faded. The untouched fire ring in their campsite caught my attention. Most campers light a fire before sunset, especially once the temperature starts dropping. Theirs remained cold. Not cold because it had gone out. Cold because it had never been lit. By 7:30, the older couple from the camper wandered past my site carrying fishing poles. "Evening," the man called. We chatted for a minute about the lake. He said they'd caught 3 bass that morning. Before leaving, he nodded toward the gray tent. "Your neighbors settle in okay?" "I guess. They seem." He searched for the word. "Quiet." "You notice too?" He chuckled. "My wife says they're probably tired." His wife looked over her shoulder. For just a second, her smile disappeared. She leaned close enough that I almost didn't hear her. "They've been sitting like that since we came back from fishing." "When was that?" She glanced at her husband. "A little after 4. I looked toward the family. They hadn't moved in nearly 4 hours. Not one of them. As darkness settled over Pine Hollow, something else changed. The birds stopped. Not gradually. All at once. One moment the trees echoed with evening calls. The next, nothing. The silence wasn't complete. The lake still lapped gently against the shore. My fire still crackled. But the woods themselves sounded empty. Even the older man paused. "That's odd." "What?" "The birds." He listened for a moment before forcing a smile. "They'll be back." The couple continued toward their camper. I watched them disappear between the trees. When I turned back, the little boy was no longer sitting in his chair. I stood. He wasn't beside the tent, wasn't behind the picnic table. I swept my flashlight across the campsite. Nothing. The father, mother, daughter. 3 chairs occupied. 1 empty. I looked away for maybe 2 seconds. When my light returned, the little boy was sitting in his chair again, facing me, exactly where he'd been before. I actually laughed. "Okay," I muttered. I definitely imagined that, but my heartbeat had picked up. Not because I'd seen something impossible, because I couldn't explain what I'd just seen. I tried distracting myself by cooking dinner. Halfway through eating, I noticed smoke from my campfire wasn't rising anymore. It drifted sideways, straight across the clearing, straight toward the silent family. The moment the smoke reached them, it split, flowing around their chairs like water moving around rocks before joining together again behind them. I stared long enough for my food to go cold. There wasn't enough wind to move the branches overhead. The lake was perfectly still, yet every strand of smoke bent toward Site 9, as if something there was pulling it in. I decided I'd had enough of wondering. I grabbed 2 unopened bottles of water from my cooler and walked across the clearing. "Evening," I called. The father looked at me immediately. The others didn't. "I brought extra water." He stood, slowly, 1 careful step at a time. He stopped just inside the edge of his campsite, close enough that I could finally see his face clearly. His smile appeared before I said another word. It was almost perfect. Almost. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. His lips smiled. His eyes didn't. "Thank you," he said calmly. "We already have everything we need." His voice was completely normal. Maybe too normal. No accent. No emotion. No hesitation. I nodded awkwardly. Well, if you need anything, just let me know. We won't. He sat back down. The conversation was over. As I turned to leave, I heard the little boy speak for the first time. His voice was barely above a whisper. Dad. The father didn't look at him. The boy continued. He's staying. I stopped walking. Behind me, the father answered just as quietly. I know. A chill ran through me. I glanced over my shoulder. All four of them were looking directly at me. Not my campsite. Not my fire. Me. Then, without warning, every light in the campground went out. My fire. The couple's lantern near the camper. Even the moon vanished behind a cloud. For one long second, the only thing I could still see in the darkness was four pairs of eyes reflecting where the family had been sitting. The lights came back almost immediately. My campfire flared as if nothing had happened. The lantern outside the older couple's camper glowed again. The moon slipped free of the clouds. Everything looked normal, except the family. They hadn't reacted. Not to the darkness. Not to the light returning. They were still sitting exactly as before, staring across the clearing. I told myself it had only been a cloud passing over the moon at the exact moment my fire died down. It wasn't a good explanation. It was simply the only one I had. I hurried back to my campsite, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The fire that had felt comforting an hour earlier now felt like a spotlight. If they were watching me, they could see every movement. I couldn't see much beyond the edge of the flames. I added another log anyway. The crackling seemed unnaturally loud. The family didn't even flinch. By 10 o'clock, the campground had settled into the familiar rhythm of night. Zippers closed. A truck door slammed somewhere near the entrance. Someone coughed in the distance. The ordinary sounds were oddly reassuring. I looked toward Site 9 again. The father was gone. His chair was empty. I frowned. The mother, daughter, and little boy hadn't moved. Only the father had disappeared. I swept my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. The beam found trunks, bushes, and drifting mist near the lake. No footsteps. No movement. No sign of him. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around. No one. When I looked back across the clearing, the father's chair was occupied again. He was sitting exactly as before, hands resting on his knees, looking directly at me. I hadn't seen him return. My pulse began to climb. I decided to stop watching them. The more I stared, the more my imagination filled in gaps. I washed my cooking pot by the water pump, locked my food in the truck, and zipped myself inside my tent. The nylon walls muted the outside world just enough to make it feel distant. I checked my watch. 10:43 p.m. Sleep didn't come. Every few minutes I'd hear something outside. Pine cone dropping, leaves shifting, the soft knock of branches touching in the breeze. Then, something else. 3 slow taps against my tent. Tap, tap, tap. Not loud, gentle, as though someone were politely knocking. I held my breath. The tapping stopped. Hello? No answer. I reached for my flashlight and switched it on. The beam lit the inside of my tent. Nothing outside moved. I listened for another minute. Silence. Eventually, I convinced myself a twig had been brushing against the fabric. I turned the flashlight off. The tapping didn't return. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. I didn't know what had disturbed me. Then I noticed it. The woods had gone completely silent. Not a single insect. Not a frog near the lake. Not even the wind. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The The clearing lay under pale moonlight. Site 9 came into view. Every chair was empty. The tent flap hung open. For the first time since sunset, the campsite appeared abandoned. Relief washed over me. They finally went to bed. I almost laughed. Then I noticed the chairs. They hadn't been left facing my campsite. Someone had turned all 4 chairs. They were now facing my tent. Empty. Waiting. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I stepped outside. The air felt noticeably colder than before. My flashlight swept across the clearing. The tent was open. No voices. No movement. No shadows. I took one cautious step closer. Then another. The fire ring was cold. As cold. I reached toward one of the chairs. The canvas was damp with dew. As though no one had sat there for hours. That didn't make sense. I'd been watching them less than 2 hours ago. I forced myself closer to the tent. Hello? Nothing. The flap moved slightly in the breeze. I shined my light inside. Sleeping bags. 4 of them. Neatly laid out. Completely untouched. No wrinkles. No backpacks. No clothes. No food. Nothing that suggested anyone had actually been living there. Just 4 sleeping bags arranged side by side. As I backed away, my flashlight landed on the ground. Fresh footprints. Bare feet. 4 different sizes. Leading away from the tent. Not toward the woods. Toward my campsite. Every footprint ended at the edge of my fire ring. There were no return tracks. I stood frozen, trying to understand what I was seeing. For people had apparently walked to my campsite and then vanished. A sudden shout shattered the silence. Hey! It came from the older couple's camper. I turned. Graham stood beside his door holding a lantern. His face looked pale. What are you doing over there? I hurried across the clearing. I thought they were gone. So did I. He looked past me toward Site 9. His expression changed instantly. They're back. I spun around. Every chair was occupied again. The father, the mother, the daughter, the little boy. All 4 sat exactly as before, watching us. Neither Graham nor I had seen them return. He lowered his voice. Don't look at them for too long. Why? My wife says every time you look away. He swallowed. They're closer. I didn't answer. I didn't want to test whether he was right, so I kept my eyes fixed on them. Then my stomach dropped. One chair wasn't where it had been before. The little boy's chair now sat just outside the edge of their campsite, closer to mine. I was certain it hadn't been there a moment earlier. I blinked. The chair hadn't moved. Had it? Or had I simply remembered it wrong? I couldn't tell anymore. For the first time that night, I genuinely considered throwing everything into my truck and driving away before sunrise. Something inside me kept saying, just make it until morning. I wish I'd listened to the other voice telling me to leave immediately. If you're still with me, you're about to hear the part of this story that convinced me I'll never camp alone in a place like Pine Hollow again. If you're enjoying this story, consider liking the video, subscribing to the Forgotten Campsite, and turning on notifications so you don't miss our next true-style camping horror story. Because from this point on, things stopped making any sense. I didn't wait for sunrise. The second Graham went back into his camper, I walked straight to my truck. I wasn't panicking. Not yet. I just wanted my keys somewhere I could grab them without thinking. I unlocked the driver's door, tossed my flashlight onto the passenger seat, and noticed something I knew hadn't been there before. A small red rubber ball. The kind you'd buy for a child. Scuffed. Faded. Wet with dew. I picked it up. It was cold enough to make my fingers ache. I looked toward Site 9. The little boy's hands rested neatly in his lap. No toy. No movement. Just those same unblinking eyes reflecting the moonlight. I walked across the clearing and gently rolled the ball toward their campsite. It stopped halfway between us. No one got up to retrieve it. The father looked at the ball, then back at me. Very calmly, he said, "You should keep it." Every instinct I had screamed that he was wrong. "I think it's your son's." The father smiled again. "It wasn't his." My mouth went dry. I left the ball exactly where it was and back toward my campsite. As I reached my fire ring, I glanced down. The ball was resting beside my boot. I stared at it for several seconds. There were no tracks in the dirt. No sign that anyone had picked it up. No marks showing it had rolled. It was simply there. I kicked it into the darkness beyond the trees. I didn't hear it land. Sleep wasn't happening. I poured myself another cup of coffee even though it was after 1 in the morning. The heat gave my hands something to do. The campground felt smaller now, as if the darkness had pushed the tree line closer. I looked toward the older couple's camper. One light glowed inside. That helped. At least someone else was awake. Then I noticed another light, much farther down the loop. Near Site 3, the green Subaru I'd seen earlier was still parked there. A flashlight flickered through the trees. Someone else hadn't been able to sleep either. For a moment, I considered walking over. Just talking to another person sounded comforting. Before I could decide, the flashlight began moving. Not toward the bathrooms. Not toward the road. Toward Site 9. The beam weaved between the trees until it reached the edge of the clearing. Then it stopped. Whoever held it was staring at the silent family. The light lingered for maybe 10 seconds. Then it switched off. I waited. Nothing. A minute passed. Then 2. No footsteps. No flashlight. No one walked back toward Site 3. They had simply disappeared into the darkness. Couldn't ignore it. Against every bit of common sense I had left, I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward Site 3. The trail between campsites was only 100 yards. Felt much longer. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder. The family never moved. They watched. Always watched. Site 3 came into view. The Subaru was there. Its driver's door stood open. A camping stove sat on the picnic table. A pot of water rested on top. Still warm. Steam drifted lazily into the cold night air. Whoever had been there hadn't left long ago. "Hello?" No answer. I checked around the tent. A backpack leaned against a tree. Hiking boots sat neatly outside the entrance. A folding chair had tipped onto its side. Everything looked as though someone had stepped away for only a minute. Then I noticed the camera. It was mounted on a small tripod facing the road. A tiny red recording light blinked steadily. Still filming. I picked it up. The screen showed it had been recording for nearly 2 hours. With shaking hands, I pressed playback. First, nothing unusual. The camper cooked dinner, read a book, walked around gathering firewood. Then, just after midnight, the camera captured him looking toward Site 9. He stood, picked up his flashlight, started walking, exactly as I'd seen. The beam reached the clearing. He froze. The recording had no sound, but I watched his shoulders stiffen. Slowly, he backed away. Then something happened that made my stomach knot. The flashlight slipped from his hand. It hit the ground. His beam spun once and illuminated the trees behind him. 4 figures stood between the trunks. The family, not sitting anymore, standing, perfectly still, only a few feet behind him. The camper never turned around. He couldn't see them. He was still staring toward Site 9, while they stood silently at his back. The recording ended abruptly. I rewound it. Frame by frame, the last clear image showed the little boy, smiling, not at the camper, at the camera. A branch cracked behind me. I nearly dropped the camera. Graham. No answer. I swept my flashlight across the woods. Nothing. Then another crack. Closer. I turned again. The forest looked empty, but something felt different. The smell. There was smoke. Fresh wood smoke. Strong enough to sting my eyes. Yet there wasn't a single campfire nearby. The wind carried it in waves. Strong. Then gone. Strong again. I backed away from Site 3. As I reached the road, my flashlight caught something nailed to a pine tree. A faded missing person flyer. Rain had washed away most of the ink. Only the photograph remained clear. The face belonged to the camper from Site 3. The same jacket. The same beard. The same baseball cap. The date at the bottom stopped me cold. Missing 2 years ago. I looked from the flyer to the Subaru parked 20 feet away. Couldn't be. The vehicle looked brand new. The coffee was still warm. The camera battery was still recording. None of it made sense. I ran. Not because something chased me, because my brain had finally accepted what my instincts had been trying to tell me all night. Nothing about Pine Hollow was behaving normally. I burst back into my campsite, breathing hard. Graham was outside his camper now. His wife stood beside him. Neither of them looked at me. They were staring across the clearing. I followed their gaze. The gray tent was gone. The chairs were gone. The fire ring was empty. Site 9 looked abandoned. My relief lasted less than a second. Graham slowly raised a trembling finger. "Don't," he whispered. "Look behind us." I didn't listen. I turned. Every hair on my body stood up. The gray tent wasn't in Site 9 anymore. It was standing at the edge of my campsite, less than 15 feet from my own tent. I knew, absolutely knew. It hadn't been there a heartbeat earlier. The flap was closed, but from inside, I heard for slow breaths. In, then a fifth. A child's voice whispered from inside the tent. "Dad." A calm voice answered. "He's still staying." The zipper on the tent door began to slide open. By itself. The zipper stopped halfway. None of us moved. Not me. Not Graham. Not his wife. The only sound in the campground was the soft crackle of my dying campfire. Then the tent flap slowly fell open. It was empty. Completely empty. No sleeping bags. No backpacks. No lantern. Nothing. Just bare ground. The 4 slow breaths had stopped. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Graham didn't. His eyes stayed fixed on the open tent. "Don't go near it," he whispered. I wasn't planning to. Then the little red rubber ball rolled out of the tent. Came to a stop against my boot. No slope. No wind. Just a slow, deliberate roll. I stepped backward. The ball stayed where it was. Then a voice drifted from somewhere behind us. "Excuse me." We spun around. The father stood beside the lake. He wasn't alone. The mother stood beside him. The daughter stood with her hands folded in front of her. The little boy held one hand up as if he wanted to ask a question in school. The gray tent behind us was still open. The family couldn't have walked from it to the shoreline without passing us. None of us had seen them move. The father smiled. "You've been very kind." His voice was calm, almost gentle. "We'd like to invite you over." No one answered. He tilted his head slightly. "It won't take long." Graham grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Get in your truck." The father took one slow step toward us. "So you're leaving?" Another step. "We hoped you'd stay." The little boy looked at me. His expression hadn't changed all night. But for the first time, he blinked. One slow blink. Then he smiled. "Dad," he said quietly. "He knows now." The father nodded. "Yes, I think he does." That was enough. Graham shouted, "Go!" I didn't hesitate. I sprinted for my truck, fumbling the keys twice before getting the door open. The engine started on the first try. Graham and his wife climbed into their camper almost simultaneously. As I threw the truck into reverse, my headlights swept across the clearing. The family hadn't moved. They simply watched. I backed onto the gravel road, shifted into drive, and hit the accelerator harder than I ever had on a campground road. My tires sprayed loose stone behind me. I expected to see the family shrinking in the mirror. Instead, the rearview mirror showed an empty campsite. No gray tent, no chairs, no people, nothing. I drove another mile before realizing something was wrong. The road should have reached the campground entrance by then. Instead, I passed Site 8. Again, I slammed on the brakes. My own campsite sat exactly where I'd left it. My fire was still burning. The family sat across from it, watching. I wasn't driving in circles. That wasn't possible. Yet somehow, I was back where I'd started. My GPS searched endlessly for a signal. Nothing. I gripped the steering wheel and forced myself to think. There was only one road in, one road out. I took a deep breath and drove again, this time without looking in the mirrors. The road curved through the trees, past the bathrooms, past the boat launch, past the campground sign. Finally, the highway. The moment my tires touched pavement, my phone chimed. 3 bars of signal. I didn't stop driving until sunrise. I called the ranger station that afternoon. A woman answered. I told her everything. There was a long silence. Then she asked one question. What campsite were you in? 8. Another pause. And the family? They were across from me. What site? 9. Her voice became very quiet. We don't have a site 9. I know what your map says. No, she interrupted. I mean, we have never had a site 9. I laughed nervously. I camped there. You couldn't have. She thanked me for calling and ended the conversation. A week later, I spread everything from that trip across my garage floor. Sleeping bag, cookware, flashlights, tent stakes. I wanted proof that I'd imagined the whole thing. As I folded my tent, something hard fell onto the concrete. A campsite reservation tag. Old, yellowed. The metal clip was rusted shut. Across the front, faded black letters read, Site 9. On the back, written in neat blue ink, were 4 words. Thank you for staying. I burned the tag that same evening. I watched until nothing remained but ash. 2 days later, I found it hanging from the rearview mirror of my truck. The edges weren't burned anymore. It looked brand new. I've never gone back to Pine Hollow. Maybe none of this makes sense. Maybe exhaustion, isolation, and a long night in the woods got the better of me. I still tell myself that sometimes. Then I remember one detail I can't explain. When I left that campground, I arrived alone. But every toll booth camera on the drive home photographed 5 people inside my truck. The transportation department sent me one of the images after a billing error. The driver's seat was exactly where I remembered. So was the passenger seat. The back seat showed 4 motion-blurred figures. The image quality was too poor to identify faces. The report marked it as a camera malfunction. I deleted the email. I wish I hadn't, because every now and then, I wake up in the middle of the night convinced someone is sitting perfectly still outside my bedroom window, waiting, watching, not speaking. If this story kept you looking over your shoulder, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the Forgotten Campsite, and turn on notifications so you never miss another chilling camping horror story. And tell me in the comments, if you had been in my place, would you have stayed until morning, or would you have left the moment you saw the family? Until next time, stay safe, and remember, There are places in the wilderness that people don't talk about, and maybe there's a reason.